All right, everybody, we got a really good one here today. Things are going to start to get really fun and interesting from here on out. We're going to talk about event-driven programming in JavaScript. So event-driven programming allows us to invoke functions when certain events occur. So we'll dive into what this means here. For example, when the page finishes loading in the browser, in this page, the alert function is triggered. So I'm just going to go ahead and refresh the page here. I'm going to hit refresh over here, and you can see that an alert pops up. So what is going on there? Let's see what's going on. I'm going to go over to Sublime Text, and I've got the file open. If I scroll on down to the body tag, the opening tag of the body tag, of the body element, I should say, I've got this attribute called onload, and its value is set to some JavaScript code right here. So what's going on is when the page completes loading, that means when the browser gets all the way down to the bottom of the very last tag, then it's going to trigger an onload event. And if we have a function hooked up to that onload event, then it'll get triggered when that event occurs. Okay, so going back to our web page here, so the completion of the page loading triggers an event, and the browser creates this event. And if we wanted to hook into that event and run some code when that event occurs, we could write a function, and then we could hook it up to that specific event, and I'll show you how to do that. And then that function would get invoked or called or triggered, however you want to say it, every time that event occurs. So the browser detects these events, and the browser actually invokes these functions for us. So I know that this all sounds kind of strange, but we'll dive in pretty deep here. So there's lots of events, lots and lots of events. Probably the most common event is for when a button gets clicked. So if you wanted to, you could hook into the click event of a specific button on your page, and we'll see a couple of different ways to do that. For example, I've got a button right here, and when I click on it, it says an alert runs that says you clicked me. Okay, so here's the code that's actually making that happen. I've got this code on the that's actually this input tag right here. And if you'll look at it, it's got this onClick attribute, and the value of that onClick attribute is some JavaScript code. So what this is saying is when the button gets clicked on, then trigger this function right here. So that's how that's working. Now, it's not recommended that you use attributes like this to hook up events. So this is kind of an old school thing, and it's not recommended anymore. So I'm showing you this because it's an easy way to get started with this event-driven JavaScript, but it's really not recommended, and after today I'm not going to use it anymore in this class, but it's good to know about. Okay, scrolling on down here, event handlers. So these functions that are getting triggered, when we create a function that's going to be hooked into an event, we call it an event handler function, and it's because it's the function that handles the event. So we'll see, you'll be hearing this term a lot. And it's really important to understand that we create these functions, meaning we declare them, but we don't actually invoke them ourselves when we write our code. The browser invokes these functions for us when the event occurs. We don't know when the event is going to occur in many instances. For example, we don't know when the user is going to press a button, so we wouldn't know when or where to write the function call in our code to do that. Instead, we hook into the event by adding an event handler function, and then we wait for the event to occur. The browser will detect when the event occurs, and the browser will invoke that event handler function for us. This is what we call event-driven programming, waiting for events to occur and then running code when they do. As I said, the browser keeps track of all of the events that occur in a page, and there's many, many, many events, and it'll trigger function calls for the ones that we've hooked into. Okay, so just to give you an idea of how many events there are that we can hook into, click on this link right here, and this will take us to a page. So Now, this is kind of overwhelming, but this shows you the power that you have at your disposal. We've got tons of different events that we can hook into, and I'm not even halfway down the page yet. So this allows us to do some extremely cool things with our JavaScript code and our web pages. So I encourage you to look this page over and kind of just browse it and see what kind of cool things you can hook into. Okay, I'm going to close that and go back to our page here. Okay, there are a couple of different ways to hook into events. We saw earlier that you can use certain attributes in the HTML elements to put to include your JavaScript code. So we actually have a couple of attributes here. We have the on mouse over attribute and the on mouse out attribute. So the on mouse over attribute is going to trigger this function, and I just called it do something. And the on mouse out attribute is going to trigger this function, which I call do something else. Now this assumes that these functions are actually written in our JavaScript code somewhere in the page, and in fact they are. I put these in a script tag at the very bottom of the page. So if you look at the very bottom of the code for this page, you'll see that I've declared these two functions, do something and do something else. So this div tag that I have written in text right here is actually this div tag right here, this blue div tag. So let me just hit F12 here. We're going to use that in a second anyways, and I'll use my inspector. So I'll click on that little button up here, and I'll click on this, and you can see that here's the HTML for that div tag that I'm hovering on right now. Anyways, I'm going to go to the console, just pull the console up, and I'm going to clear the console. And now what you can see here is when I hover over, there's our do something function running, and when I hover off, there's our do something else. So if you're like me, this will just float your boat, and you can do this all day and watch these events occur and just have all sorts of fun and stay up late at night. So as I mentioned, you can use these attributes to hook up events, but it's not recommended, and we can talk about why in class. There's much better ways to do it. So if you're curious about that, bring it up in class and we'll talk about it. So I'm going to go ahead and close the console here. And so another way to hook up an event handler is to get a handle on a node object from the DOM and then set a specific property on it by assigning the event handler function to it. So what does that mean right here? Let's go ahead and copy this code chunk right here. I'll copy that and then go over to Sublime Text, and let's look for our script tag that we used as our little playground for testing all this stuff out. And if you scroll down, it's somewhere around 200, so somewhere around 221. Hopefully it's around the same line number for you, but I'm going to go ahead and paste this code snippet in there and then quickly format it like that. And then so let's see what's going on here. First of all, we're getting a handle on a node from the DOM. So we're using the document object, and it's get element by ID method, and we are grabbing an element from the DOM that has an ID attribute set to my div, and that's that red div that says click here on the inside on the page. And then so we've got that node object stored in this variable, and then we use dot notation to access one of its properties. And in this case, what we're doing is we're assigning a value to the onClick property, and this value actually happens to be our function. So I think I mentioned earlier that it was at the bottom of the page, but I pulled a quick one on you and I moved it to the top of the page to avoid a problem. But if you scroll all the way up to the top of the page and inside the head tag somewhere, you shall see that I've got these two functions, do something and do something else. So these are our event handler functions, and we are hooking those into the onClick event of that div, and the div has an ID of my div. So let me scroll back down to our where our code is right here, around line 227 or so roughly. So I'll go ahead and save that code, and then I'll bounce back over to the browser. Let me see, did I lose my place here? Okay, here it is, and here's that div, and this has an ID attribute set to my div, and that's how we got a handle on it. And I'm going to hit F12 to pull up the console. Why didn't that come up? There it goes. Okay, so now when I click on this div, you'll see in the console that sure enough that doing something event handler function got triggered when I clicked on that event. When I clicked on that div, not that event. Now, something very important that I want you to notice is that we don't have the parentheses here. So this is a function. I don't think we've seen this yet in this class. But the reason why we don't have the parentheses here is because that would actually invoke this function right away. And if this function had a return value, then whatever its return value was would be assigned to this property. And that's not what we want. So again, we're not invoking these event handler functions. The browser is going to evoke them when the on-click event happens when somebody clicks on that div, which is this div right here. So that's why we don't put the parentheses here. That's really important to understand, and that's a mistake that I think a lot of beginners make, is when they're hooking up events they'll put the parentheses here. So just be aware of that. Okay, I'm gonna close the developer tools here and scroll on down. So I want to show you something else. Okay, so we just did this code snippet up here, and now we're down here. So here is another way that you'll see these event handlers being hooked up. So just like what I had before, I have we get a handle on my div. That's what we want to listen for events on. So we want to listen for when that gets clicked on. So we have that as a node object here. And then we're actually assigning a value to its on-click property using dot notation here. But look at what's going on here. Instead of, we're actually declaring a function at the same time that we're assigning it to this on-click property. Now you can do this, and you'll see this more often than what I just showed you, where we actually had a function name here. But in this case, we're actually declaring the function, the event handler function, and assigning it all at once, all in the same statement. So, and when we do this, this function has no name. So it's kind of just a one-time use function. And because it has no name, we can't refer to it anywhere else other than this statement. So, and you'll see this quite often in JavaScript. These are called anonymous functions because they have no name. So I guess if you had a function that you wanted to reuse on all sorts of events, on all sorts of nodes all over the place, then it would be better to go ahead and declare it once, like where did that code snippet go? Like here. So if you were going to use this do something function all over the place and hook it up to a bunch of events, it would make more sense to just declare it once and then use its name. Because otherwise, if you did this approach, you'd be rewriting your code all over the place. So if you're going to reuse the event handler, then give it a name, declare it and give it a name. But a lot of times these event handlers, like I said, they're just one-time uses, so we can get away with doing anonymous functions instead. So this will take a little bit of getting used to, especially if you've programmed in other languages, because they don't always allow this sort of thing, but JavaScript does. So what's really going on here is we're assigning a function to a property. Okay, now let's move on to what I think is the best way to hook up functions. And it's by every node has a method called add event listener. So and this add event listener method takes two parameters. The first one specifies the event that we're listening to. So in this case, we're listening for click events, or we're waiting for click events to occur on my div. So when the user clicks on this div, then it will trigger this do something function for us. So we can use this add event listener method. It was designed for hooking up event handlers. Okay, now one important thing that I want to point out is that this doesn't have an on here. Like what we saw previously, everything was on click, whether it was in those attributes or the node, the on click property of the node object. But when you use add event listener, you don't have the on prefix for some reason, and I really don't know why that is. Kind of strange. Okay, now another thing is that we're doing something here that we've never done before in this class as far as I know, and we're actually taking a function and passing it in as a parameter to another function. So remember, do something, this is a function, so and we're using it as a parameter here. So this is something that you can't do in lots of other languages. They don't allow you to pass functions around as parameters, but JavaScript does allow it, and it's actually a really powerful feature. And actually other languages are starting to adopt this feature because it is so powerful, and we're going to see it all over the place from here on out. So this do something is a function, and we're passing it as a parameter to add event listener. So just be aware of that. We've passed numbers, strings, booleans, and we even passed objects as parameters in our previous exercises. Well, now we're passing functions in as parameters. So like I said, if you're coming from a different language that doesn't allow this, this might seem totally foreign to you. Okay, another variation of what we just looked at is this sample right here. So in this example, we're getting a handle on my div just as we were before, and then we want to listen for when my div gets clicked on. So we have this node object, and we use dot notation to invoke this add event listener method, and we're listening for the click events. That's what we're waiting for to happen. And now in this case we're using an anonymous function instead of a name. In the previous example we were passing in a function name, but in this case we're using an anonymous function. And now this is the most common way of hooking up events in JavaScript. So I know this syntax is a little bit tricky for beginners, but this is the way it's done. This is the recommended, or I don't know if it's recommended, but this is the way you'll see it done by most programmers. So they'll use these anonymous functions. So I know this gets a little bit messy to look at, but if we want to break it down, let's just take away the body of the function. So in this case, here's the body of that event handler function. So when we press on my div, we're going to see this alert that says foo. So let's just take that out of the equation, because of it we have to break up our code into multiple lines and things like that. So let's just take the body of the function away and remove the return carriages, and this is what we get here. So what you can see here is the first parameter to add event listener is the event that we're waiting for to occur, and then the second parameter is a function that we want to be invoked when the event occurs. So if you take away the body of the function and put everything on one line, you can kind of visualize a little bit better what's going on. But again, this is strange to people who have worked in other languages, not JavaScript. You can't pass functions as parameters. So in this case, it's an anonymous function, and we're actually declaring it at the very same time as we are passing it into this method, add event listener. So we're actually declaring it and passing it as a parameter all in one statement. So interesting. Okay, last thing before we're done is, remember at the beginning of this exercise when we hooked into the onload event of the page by adding an attribute to the body tag, and I told you that you shouldn't really hook up events by using those attributes, and you should use add event listener. I think that's the way that we're going to hook up events from here on out in the class. Well, if you wanted to do that approach with add event listener, you would have to do it on the window object. So this page load event, when the page loads, it's the window object that creates this load event, I guess. So remember, the window is at the top of the DOM hierarchy. So, and that's an object, and it has this add event listener method just like every other node does, and we pass in the event that we're waiting for. So we're waiting for the page to load, and again, when you use add event listener, you don't put the on before that, you just put the event name without the on, and then we have an anonymous function that's going to run when, and here's that whole function that I've got highlighted right there. So that function will run when the page loads, and then this parentheses matches this parentheses right over here. So everything Everything in between those two parentheses are the parameters to this method call here. So okay, that will do it.